Today is the Active Directory audit, so it's a set of PowerShell scripts for you to run. I kind of already talked about this. They're free to you. They're out on the website already. First time you run these scripts, and there's a set of 3 scripts, it can be overwhelming. It's going to bring a lot of information and a lot of accounts that a lot of you probably don't know about in your Active Directory environment. Some common things we do see are like health mailbox accounts, service accounts. But this all kind of goes under that category of Active Directory oversight. And so for everything that kind of sticks around that isn't disabled after you've gone through this, we recommend using the description field for that account. And so when we run through some examples, I'll show that. Ultimately, we recommend running these scripts or getting similar through whatever tools you have on a quarterly basis just to stay on top of things. You will need admin, preferably domain admin capability to run these, and access to your domain controller to be able to run these as well. And so if you don't have admin or domain admin access or access to the domain controller, you'll have to have your vendor run them, or you just won't be able to run them at all. And so, I'm going to do this in a couple ways. I'm going to start out, I'm going to just go through the instructions on how to run this, and then I'm going to pull open some of the sample documents and what it's looking at. And then I'm going to go through the instructions one more time and then finish the webinar. And so for you to run this properly, you have to be able to, one, access the domain controller. So you log into your domain controller, your primary domain controller, and on there you want to go to your C drive and you want to create a folder called AD Audit. So I think it's not case sensitive, but just for simplicity, just capital A, capital D, Audit, AUDIT, one word, right? As you see in this screenshot here. So hopefully that makes sense. The permissions from running it from PowerShell to put a folder out there in AD Audit, those don't seem to always work. And so even if you're running it as an admin, and so make sure you have that AD Audit folder on the C drive on the domain controller. And then you're going to want to, and just so you can see here, I'm down here, I click on that Windows icon and I search for PowerShell. You'll want to go to PowerShell ICE, so Windows PowerShell ISE, and you'll want to, if it comes up here, you want to run as administrator or right click and run as administrator. And so this is key. If you don't run it as an administrator, it can't see everything properly and it'll give you junk data back. So for example, you'll have all your disabled users showing up in enabled users. You'll have your enabled users showing up in disabled users. It really, unless you run it as an admin, it's going to make it's just unusable in every way. It's just going to prompt you to send me an email saying this thing doesn't work. So make sure you run as administrator. And so again, search for PowerShell, PowerShell ICE, and then run as administrator. So I'll just pull that up. And so that comes up with something like this, right? It looks like a terminal window, so it's PowerShell. And then you want to get the 3 text files. So once you download these off of our site, there are 3 text files. There's AD Audit Core _v10.txt, AD Audit Member Groups Final No Blanks Groups _v8.txt, and then AD Audit Blank Groups Final v1.txt. So you'll want to take those 3 and either move them to your domain controller onto the desktop someplace, or put them in a shared, some shared directory, and then go to your domain controller and access them from there. Because all these scripts, right now as they're configured, will need to be run on the domain controller itself. So there are 3 total scripts. So the first step is to open, so it goes in this order, honestly, it's the core, then this member groups final, and then blank groups. And so you open up the core code, you open it up in Notepad or whatever your tool of choice is. You can do either Control A, Control C, or Edit, select all, and then Edit, copy. Then you go back to your PowerShell window, and remember, you ran this as an admin. You can either do Control V or you can right click and do paste. And so it'll fail on mine. I don't have a domain controller to go to. And then you hit enter. So hopefully that makes sense. You go out, copy the code, put it into PowerShell. And again, you're running PowerShell as an admin on your domain controller. Pop it in here. The code is only doing GET requests. It's not making any changes whatsoever to Active Directory. If you have the stamina, look through it. It's literally just getting information from Active Directory. And so, and then you hit enter. And what happens after you hit enter is it'll come up with a prompt, and it's kind of my disclaimer saying, by continuing this script, you acknowledge that we're not responsible, right? But it's only running this script. So when you see that prompt, you click Control C to exit or enter to continue. So if you're running the script, you want to click enter. And then it'll come up with one more prompt. So if you notice, I had you put a folder inside the C drive called AD Audit. That's the default path. And so if you want to create a folder elsewhere, you can create a folder elsewhere, and it just has to be called AD Audit, but then you put your path in this prompt here. And so from my perspective, just go ahead and put the AD Audit folder in the C drive. The code just works perfectly with that. And so, but if you did create that AD Audit folder inside the C drive, then just hit enter and it'll continue. And there's a progress bar that shows up at the top. It's not the most advanced progress bar. But bottom line is, this should not, for really all of your environments, it should not take more than 2 to 5 minutes to run. I guess if you're if you're over 3 billion in assets, maybe you have enough employees where that Active Directory environment might take 4 to 5 minutes, but really it should run pretty rapidly. And so you'll get this final screen called Data Export Successful. The results were saved to the C Audit folder. And so then when you go to your C AD Audit folder, what you'll see here are these first A through R. You'll see these CSVs produced. So AD Audit Summary, Policy Info, all the way down to DC Accounts. So those first A through R will be there in the AD Audit folder. So if you don't have those in the folder itself, a couple of things could happen. One, you might not have run as admin. And two, maybe you spelled this AD Audit incorrectly. And so capital A, capital D, capital A, and then UDIT, AD Audit, for that folder on the C drive. So it shows this. And so we'll start plugging through those as well, but it's looks like a lot of information, so don't get overwhelmed with the amount of information. It's good stuff. It gets easier as you do it. So the next script is called AD Audit Member Groups Final No Blank Groups _v8.txt. And so that one is essentially once a quarter you should be going through. It lists out all the different groups that you have in AD and who is a member of each group. And so you'll want to take that and walk through it, and but you just same thing. You open the text document, Control A, Control C, or select all and copy. Then go back out here and paste it in and click enter and run it. And once you run that, it will create an additional file called S:\AD groups and members.csv. And then similarly, so this script does not get blank groups. So I took blank groups out of this script. And so the one thing about it is if you have foreign relationships in there, so we call FSPs, Foreign Security Principles. So when a group from a trusted external domain or forest is added to a group in the local domain, an FSP object is created in the local domain to represent the external group. And so bottom line is, if you've done a domain migration or you've had any external references to a group, it's going to error on that group. And the most common one that we see erroring out on is this IIS_IUSRS group, which is created when you install IIS. And so generally speaking, you don't want to install IIS on the domain controller. But if you have, that group is there, and likely it'll have a foreign relationship. So it'll err on that, but it'll keep going. And so it just won't produce information for the group that has these FSP relationships. And so you will want to write down the name of the group that has that foreign relationship and talk to your MSP or your IT team about it to see, does it really need to have that? And if it doesn't, you remove that foreign relationship and then rerun the script and it'll capture it. But the IUSRS group, just for simplicity, that's never going to get shown through our script. We hard-coded that in to ignore it. Just in testing, we saw a lot of times where that was just creating a problem. And so, and like I said, that creates an S audit group members folder. And then the next script, just since we ignored blank groups, this next one, same thing, double click, open the document itself. It's this AD audit blank group final v1 txt. Select all, copy it, go into your PowerShell, paste it in, click enter and run it. There aren't any prompts on this one. It'll create a folder t blank ad groups.csv. And so the idea there is if you have groups out there with no members in it, why do you really have the groups out there? Is it necessary? You might want to clean that up. And so, and that'll create that T blank group. And so, here are some of the things that we're looking at. So that first document that gets made, that first CSV. So one thing on your domain controller itself, usually you don't have Excel on there. So you want to copy all this information out to a shared drive or pull it over to your local drive somehow. However you do that. So you can open it up with Excel. Right? And so pull it over to your local drive or use your local computer to get that. So AD audit summary is going to look at a couple things, and these are going to be really summary statistics for the details that happen later on in there. And so it's a CSV, so it doesn't save the formatting if you save it. So if you want to save it down as an Excel document, do File, Save As, and then choose Excel and save it. Otherwise, you just keep reopening it like that. So it'll talk about how many accounts do you have in Active Directory. And so these are all fake numbers. Of those accounts, how many are enabled, and then how many are disabled. So adding these two together should add up to the total accounts. And then we look at the number of accounts that have been dormant for between 45 and 90 days. So CIS Controls is big on looking at accounts that have been dormant for over 45 days and then either justifying why they're dormant or just oversight-wise knowing why accounts are 45 to 90 days, over 45 days dormant. And so from our perspective as a community bank, it's 45 days is a unique number to be looking at. And so we also added in dormant accounts that have been dormant, so not being actively used, not logged in as an interactive user, between 90 to 365 days, and then dormant accounts over 365 days. And so I put this in here for over 365 days because to me that's low-hanging fruit. If you have an account, there are people still joining. Okay, so if you have an account that has not been used in 365 days, you really have to wonder, is the account necessary? And so I think I would take a close look at on the individual document that we see for that one. And so, and then start cleaning it up from there. So hopefully that makes sense. So we have the number of dormant accounts between 45 to 90 days, 90 to 365 days, and then over 365 days. And initially you really want to focus in on these dormant accounts over 365 days. And then there's going to be some overlap between these. And again, these are all made up numbers, but we also look at accounts that have never logged in. And so on there, if you see an account that's never logged in and it's been out there for the last 10 years, likely it's not being used. It's time to disable that or even delete that account. And so, but you could also see accounts in that group where you have a new employee starting the following week, and so you've gone through and created their Active Directory accounts, so they might show up in there too. And in that case, you wouldn't do anything with that. And so, and then we look at members of privileged groups, so admins, domain admins, schema admins, enterprise admins, and so I'll show that as well later, but this is anyone that we consider to be a privileged user account that's in one of those groups. And then this is really just informational. You're going to see high numbers in here. I think most banks, when they change out a laptop or change out a device, don't go through Active Directory and clean that up and remove the computer account. But they're in there, and you can take a look through that and see it. But what you're going to have is a ton of different computer accounts in there that I think you'll probably sit there and say, well, that computer hasn't been here for 5 years, right? And so maybe it's time to clean up those computer accounts on there. And so, but I wouldn't focus too much on this one. This is more informational. And so, and then server accounts. And you notice how I put the 0 as an example there? A lot of the banks that we're working with, I think for whatever reason, are labeling their server accounts as a computer account. I think by default going forward, some of the newer server operating systems are labeling them properly. So if you see a 0 in this field, but you find them in the computer account, if you go into Active Directory, you'll see that you actually labeled it as a computer account, and that's why it shows up that way. And then your DC accounts, so your domain controllers that are there. It'll pop up and show you what your domain controllers are. After that, the scripts also look at accounts that you have where the password is set to never expire. So generally speaking, you don't want to see any user accounts with passwords never set to expire. These are typically going to be your server, your service accounts. So you'll want to go through that list as well. Accounts where the password is not required. So I think everybody on this webinar would definitely, I think, probably be on the same page that you want all your accounts to have a password required. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that a password has not been set. It's just it was configured so that the account could be created without a password. And so you'll want to change that. And so this SID history, without getting into too much detail, I'm just going to kind of briefly describe what SID is, and I'm going to read off a set of documents I have. So the SID is it's a security identifier is what it stands for, SID. It's a unique value that is used to identify an object, such as a user or a group, in AD. And so the SID history is an attribute in Active Directory used to store former SIDs used by a user account. And so it really comes into play when you're migrating accounts from one domain to another. And so when you move a user account between domains, a new SID is created for the user account in the new domain. And so to allow for seamless access to resources, the old SID is added to the SID history of the user account in the new domain. And so it's useful during migrations, but it can also pose a security risk if it's not properly managed. So old SIDs can potentially be used to gain unauthorized access. So it's generally recommended to clear the SID history once a domain migration is done. Basically, if you see any numbers in here with SID history, I would work with the MSP to get rid of the SID history. And so reversible encryption, you want to have that enabled across the board. So any accounts you have with reversible encryption turned off, that's a problem. DES encryption, so you want to use the higher level encryption. You just don't want to have any account. There's really no good reason to have accounts with DES encryption. I think AES encryption is the stronger version. You'll want to, if you have accounts in here, work with your MSP to get rid of those, to upgrade those accounts to use a better form of authentication. And then this Kerberos pre-authentication. So Kerberos pre-authentication is the process where the client's identity is verified before any Kerberos tickets are issued. And so there is an option of do not require Kerberos pre-authentication. And so if you have that enabled, then you're causing risk. And so you really want to zero in this number, and you want to investigate anything else. You want to disable that option on all your accounts. And so you can tell it's a lot of information, so it'll take a little bit of time to go through, but at a minimum, if you start with these top items, you'll find yourself understanding your Active Directory environment substantially better. And so the next CSV is policyinfo.csv, so it's labeled B. When you pull that up, that has a number of things in it. So for whatever reason, the account and key are all the same. But so that's looking at, basic policy info. So your account lockout threshold, ideally between 3 and 5. Your default password policy, so the maximum password age, the minimum password length. This KRBTGT account, without getting, I'm just going to read kind of what it is. The KRBTGT account is a domain default account, acts as a service account for the KDC service. And so, bottom line is, it should be, generally speaking, disabled. So if this enabled says false, that means you're in a good spot. If enabled is true, then what you want to do is look at the date the last password was reset. These KRBTGT accounts come by default. You'll want to make sure you're resetting the password every 180 days, but you definitely want to work with your MSP about it, because resetting that account is somewhat complicated. I think you have to do it twice in succession so it doesn't cause any problems. And so your lockout duration, we always recommend 0 to force an admin involvement in unlocking locked accounts. The lockout observation window, password complexity, is it enabled? This is looking at your group policy. Password expiration, password history account. So you want 24. Your password length, ideally 8 to 14, whatever you're at with that. And then there's this value called a tombstone value. So the tombstone lifetime in Active Directory refers to the period of time that a deleted object is retained in Active Directory. So a user or a computer account that you delete, the amount of time that it's sitting there still in the Active Directory database before it's permanently deleted. And so when an object is deleted from AD, it isn't immediately removed from the database. Instead, most of the object's attributes are cleared out, and the object is marked as a tombstone and moved to a special container for deletion, essentially. And so, really, on that account, Microsoft recommends that that value be set to 180 days. So if you see a blank, so if you see a value here and it says like 3720, I think you'll want to change that to 180. You'll want to work with your MSP to get that value down a little bit to 180. If it's set to 2, which is the minimum amount that value can be set to on most Windows, on most of the servers, you probably want to increase it, because leaving that information there is good in case you accidentally delete something. And so here are Microsoft's defaults. Right, so Server 2012. I mean, honestly, if you're running any of this 2003 stuff, you've got bigger issues than this Active Directory audit. But these are the defaults. So generally speaking, going forward, the default is 180 days. So if this value comes in blank, just verify that it's not set and it's using a default value with your MSP. So the next scripts are where we kind of dig into the details. And so enabled accounts, this is a list. It's just going to give you a list of enabled accounts. You see this description field. I don't know if anyone remembers me mentioning that, right? So a lot of times you'll have all these accounts listed down here and there's no description for what they are. If you have things on here like service accounts and things like that, it's a good idea in Active Directory to go ahead and put some type of description in for the account. So when you rerun this, you're not constantly chasing your tail saying, well, I don't remember what this account is or who this is for or anything like that. And so it tells you this particular one will list out all of your enabled user accounts. It'll tell you here, just as a double check that they're enabled. It'll tell you when they were created. And it will tell you whether the password never expires, and it'll tell you the password last set. So when the password was last set. So the idea is just to make sure that if you have accounts in the enabled users that are enabled that don't need to be enabled, as you look through this list, that's the time where you want to start disabling them or taking action on them. The next one shows you all your disabled accounts. I don't know how much of a priority this is. If you're at the point where you really have things cleaned up, that's where you can go and start looking. It'll tell you when it's been created. So in this example, if it was created on 1/19/2013 and you disabled it, chances are you don't need it anymore. So it might be time to just delete it permanently. If you go into E, so this is where I'm just going to show E, dormant activity. So 365 days plus. So these are accounts that have not interactively logged in using Active Directory in over 365 days. And so you see how this description field is going to be useful. When you start seeing things come in here, it'll automatically populate in here. And so, truly speaking, anything that shows up in here, I think you really have to microanalyze why it's showing up in here. Meaning, what's the use of that account? Is there a legitimate reason? Right? So if you see a user account showing up in here, and that user's probably gone, or there's got to be some other reason going on. There could be other reasons, but I would just make sure you're justifying it. But this is a good list to start with. I think most of you will have 28 plus accounts show up on here. If you have only 4 or 5, it'll be unique. And so you'll want to look at that list and work with your MSP to start disabling those accounts that aren't needed. And those are the same for the 90 to 365 days and the 45 to 90 days. And so there's going to be overlap between these, so especially at those that haven't logged in for 365 days. This is a report that's going to show you accounts that have never logged in. So look at when it was created. If there's no reason to keep them around, definitely disable those. And then privileged users, so it's going to look at a number of different groups. So in the code, I'm just going to show this here. If you're creative and you want to add your own groups in here, there's this $ privilege groups. It includes the groups to look for. So it's looking for administrators, domain admins, enterprise admins, schema admins, account operators. You'll see the list there. They're all comma separated and they have single quotes around them. If you want to add your own groups to that, you're more than welcome to do that. So, this will tell you essentially the name of the user and what groups they're a member of. So like this example 3 is part of the administrators, enterprise admins, schema admins, group policy creator owners, and domain admins group. Example 1 is part of the administrators group. So this is just, again, oversight to make sure that there are no members of a bunch of groups that you don't really intend to. So you can clean up from there. So you're going to see, this is where I was saying, you're going to see a lot of accounts show up in here that are passwords never expire, that are set for password never to expire. Make sure the service accounts really need to be there, that you haven't done some core system migration, and those are old service accounts that were used for a core that's just not really in place. So remove the accounts. This description field is important. I would make sure you populate the description field in Active Directory so it keeps coming up and anybody after you can know what they were for. And so, but hopefully everyone gets the picture, right? And so this is no data. If we see that SID history, no data, that means it didn't find any accounts with SID history. And so reversible encryption, DES encryption. This computer accounts one is the one that's going to show a ton of different things, and so I would just say informationally use those. And so if you run the other 2 scripts, this 80 groups and members.csv, that will show the group name and then who's a member of it. And so obviously this is going to be longer. And so again, this is why that description field is going to be important. So you know exactly why that account exists. Because believe me, when you start going through this, there's a lot of accounts on there that you just really don't know about. And so this will be a lot longer for everybody. This was just an example. So this will say enterprise admin. It'll have the members of it. So you just walk through it and make sure that the members of each group really should be a member of each group. And so some of you will put groups for your branches. So like branch A, branch B, branch whatever, Waukee, Iowa. Make sure that the people that are in it should be in it. And if they're not, look to remove them from that group. So all this is oversight related. And so, and then the blank 80 groups, this is just going to list sequentially all of the groups that have no members inside of it. So I just put group 1, 2, 3. Have groups with no members in it, you have to question why you have the group. And you might be that you have a placeholder for something else. There could be legitimate reasons, but just make sure no one accidentally created a group, a test group or whatever that you don't really need, and remove those groups if they're not there. And so I would say continuously just keep running it, cleaning it up, running it, continuing it. You'll be reaching out to your MSP, you'll be reaching out to your vendors to say, is this account necessary? What's this account used for? but it gets you a really good level of oversight over your Active Directory environment and what users and groups are allowed in your Active Directory environment. And so, but once it's cleaned up, I would say the frequency that we would expect you to be running this. Hint from an audit perspective, what we're expecting is to be run quarterly, is to have that oversight quarterly over your Active Directory environment. And so once it's cleaned up, it's going to be very, very easy. It's just that initial cleanup is going to take some time. Now, I'm just going to really quick cover that one more time. So what you do is, to run these scripts, you have to have admin privileges or domain admin privileges. Ideally, you have to have access to the domain controller. Go out to your domain controller, create a folder on the C drive called AD Audit, just like that screenshot. Open up PowerShell, so go down to the bottom, type PowerShell, use PowerShell ICE, it's just what we've tested with. Maybe the other versions work, maybe they don't. I haven't tested with them, I just know ICE works. And so either choose Run as Admin or right click and do Run as Admin. If you don't run it as admin, you will have issues. It'll produce junk data. So I think one of my first questions, if you do email me and say, hey, this is producing some really funky data, is going to be, did you right click and run as admin? It's kind of the equivalent of network support. Is your computer plugged in? So there are 3 text files. Make sure that they're available for you to copy and paste and to plug into that PowerShell command inside of Active Directory. And so you're going to run PowerShell on your domain controller itself, and then you're going to copy the code from here. Do Control A, Control C, or select edit, select all, and then edit, copy. Then you'll go into your PowerShell, again, PowerShell on the domain controller itself, and you'll right click and do paste it in, run it. You'll get for that first set, you'll get a series of prompts. It'll prompt kind of our disclaimer there, which as reading this disclaimer is probably not the best disclaimer, but click enter to continue. It'll ask you if you want to set a custom path. If you put that AD audit folder in the C drive, which is what we have tested, just hit enter and continue. Once it's completed, you'll get a successful screen, and then you'll have A through R files created at that point. And then choose the next text document, which is right here, this AD audit member groups, no blank groups. So the no blank groups mean we're ignoring blank groups in there. So open that up, copy it, plug it into PowerShell, run it, and it will create this S AD audit members file, and then do the same thing for AD audit blank groups final V1 text, and that'll create a T blank group AD audits group. So that's all I really have. I think it will provide value. I think all the banks that have run it have found it valuable, and so I guess there is the option, if you want us to run it for you, we can charge for it. We are going to be doing password audits going forward, and that's a separate audit that we have, and so I don't want this to be a marketing call, but we're going to have where we take your NTLM hashes or your hashes out of essentially all of your user accounts in Active Directory, and we run our password cracking on those to determine if they're using weak passwords and if we're able to crack those passwords.